Hello, this is Philip again. Today we are doing Chapter 1 of The Bolshevik Invasion of the West by Budenz, Louis Francis Budenz. The chapter title is Curtain Raiser on Continuous Conflict, 1933 to 1963. I already read this and it's fascinating, so let's get to it. I'm going to try for less commentary this time. In commenting on the risks and rewards for contemporary historians and examining our own times, the New Cambridge Modern History, Volume 7, puts forth some sound advice. Even while conscious of the bugbear of bias, this work considers it important that these historians should not shirk from the duty of making available to those who must shape the immediate future the best understanding of the age that their techniques and skills can achieve. End quote. Then we are solemnly told, in quotes, to abdicate that duty would be to abandon the field to propagandists and soothsayers. End quote. That may be said to provide the precise purpose for this inquiry into the crisis of this hour. This age of ours, perhaps above all past periods, in the story of man, is overrun with propagandists and soothsayers. The propagandists, with a rare skill, emanated initially from Moscow and Peking, bringing about for what has come to be depicted of a stupefied America the successful Soviet continuance of the encirclement of the West mapped out by Joseph Stalin. The pursuance of this plan of that giant among Soviet leaders is now visible on the African continent, specifically in the Congo. In Asia, South Vietnam, and in Latin America, beginning with Cuba, the soothsayers are alleged wise men of the Western world, supposedly led by America, who are aided by many journalists in relying on gossip, thus to evade and avoid the communist directive documents. We are witnessing of the strangest phenomena in almost complete absence in official Washington statements or in any of the great American journals of any reference to these documents, from the World Marxist Review, originally the Communist International, to Political Affairs and the Worker in the United States. Such an odd refusal to acquaint the American people with what Moscow and Peking are saying to their followers in the way of instruction tends to lead many Western officials and newspaper men to repel that nation, despite its great physical strength, to succumb step by step before Bolshevik aggression. It is this development which caused Pope Pius XI, one of the most astute students of communism, to designate the conspiracy of silence on the part of a large section of the general press of the world as one of the chief causes of Soviet communism's advance. Any review of the Bolshevik invasion of the West, the outstanding phenomena in our present history, must be devoted to the critical rejection of propagandists and soothsayers alike. Such can be done solely through the recitation of the realities of living current philosophies and subsequent events, particularly of living communism. This is the task laid indirectly by the Cambridge Modern History itself on the shoulders of those who have studied for years in a critical way the Marxist-Leninist classics and the Moscow-Peking directive documents. While the work's Volume 12 concludes that the October Soviet Revolution can already be seen to have initiated Russia's extraordinary ascendancy as a world power, and also to have found a gigantic sequel in the Chinese Revolution. It finally closes its pages without any real answer to the spiritual and intellectual confusion it finds loose in the world in 1945. 20 years later, any historian would find this confusion foggier still. As the year 1965 began to dawn, we were greeted with a salvo of new isolationists or surrender demands from that very camp which had promoted Western, and specifically American, disarray and near defeat. The present-day American Republic has discovered itself In the midst of one of those political earthquakes which transform and devastate men and empires from age to age, most American scholars and statesmen, nevertheless, remain in what can be termed blissful ignorance as to the origins and objectives of this upheaval. At this very moment, when these gentlemen are stuffing our ears against the opening cry of the Communist Manifesto, in quotes, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism," end quote. That cry rings out loudly throughout the communist camp. It proclaims that the specter is now haunting the whole world. At this time, too, when certain dominant Wall Street interests in official Washington are beguiled by the Soviet chant for peaceful coexistence, the thought is emphasized to all communists from that very manifesto that, in quotes, "the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles," end quotes. And the comrades are carefully schooled in the understanding that peaceful coexistence is in itself a phase of the class struggle of today. Undoubtedly, one of the reasons that American leadership closes its eyes to foreign affairs in all their grim impalpability is that the United States is so amazingly productive. It makes the USA still, in the growth and gross of national product, by far the most powerful nation in the world. On Christmas Day 1964, there was sent out from Washington a special news report which let Americans know that the gross national product for 1964 will be about $624 billion. This exceeds the 1963 gross product by at least $40 billion. To measure properly the magnitude of this production, it can be added that Soviet Russia had a total product of about $260 billion in 1963, and only slightly more the following year. Indeed, this American economic growth seems lately to outstrip Soviet gains for the 3 last years combined. In military strength, it may be added, the United States vies with this economic record. In appearing on the National Broadcasting Company's program in early January 1965, Secretary of State Dean Rusk declared that American military prowess was so strong that it was beyond the imagination of any man. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara has confirmed this judgment most emphatically on more than one occasion, as shall be unfolded as we go along. Mr. McNamara's last statements in what amounted to claims for military invincibility for the United States was made dramatically at the NATO meeting in Paris in December 1964. Now, a comment about today, about some current events going on today. Essentially, Russia has checkmated the United States. Checked the United States. I'm not going to say checkmate, but we can't back up Europe anymore because they now have missiles that can destroy our cruise ships, ships carrying troops, etc. We couldn't pull off a D-Day on Russia, essentially, anymore. Not to mention they tested some missiles that can take out our satellites, and our military today completely relies on all this surveillance stuff going on that's done by the satellites out there, and they could just take all that out. Anyway, just something about current events to consider. In these respects, the United States closely resembles the Roman Empire of the Antonines, which won such enthusiastic applause from Edward Gibbon. It cannot be forgotten, however, that it was on the eve of that period, when the empire was at its physical and military peak, that Hadrian entered upon the path of appeasement. For the first time in its history, Rome beheld under his tutelage the withdrawal of the god Terminus from its accustomed place, signaling that the empire for the first time was shrinking. The vision of the Great Society presented by President Lyndon B. Johnson to the Congress in January 1965 has also tended to obscure the seriousness of United States setbacks abroad. The concentration by American citizens on the president's attempts to convert a Madison Avenue slogan into breathing and pulsing achievements in national life could have no other effect. The curbing or curing of poverty for the unborn child on to the man preparing for his funeral is an appeal that reaches out into many quarters. Alarm, however, at the sudden loss of allies and the widespread collapse of American prestige among small nations led to a strange outcome. Many of those who had contended that all the United States had to do was to display itself as a showcase of democracy and, of course, of riches, ungraciously grumbled at the alleged absence of concern on the part of the White House for events in Asia, Africa, and other continents. In strange contrast to its consistent plea for giving in to Soviet communism in Spain, Cuba, China, and the satellite nations, the New York Times led all the rest. When Mr. Johnson, stung by the encircling assaults on America in Southeast Asia, in the Congo, and in Latin America, sought to do something, he was subjected by much the same interests to a fusillade of abuse. It became evident that those forces, again helped on by the Times, were actually trying to compel him to make any possible deal with Soviet Russia, that is, if in their uncertain state they had anything in mind. In no forum, neither in American newspapers nor in official Washington, was it even suggested that the delineation of the Great Society was a throwing down of the gauntlet to Moscow and Peking. It was not posed as a refutation to the many years' pledge of communism that its gigantic goal was to finally bring about a world communist society. There was no hint that this was an answer to the declaration of the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union held in 1961. There it had been definitively set down that the beginnings of communism in Soviet Russia would be witnessed in the year 1980. Then all goods and services would be distributed without cost, and this included free maintenance of children at children's institutions, rent-free housing, and free municipal transport, together with free medical services for all Soviet citizens, and free public catering. So, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Kind of. Though today the tactic seems like just depopulate everyone until you can actually do that. Anyway, there was no knowledge of this program among average Americans, or even among most of the better informed, for the simple reason that this communist prediction of utopia had been scantily discussed or debated in the leading journals or in the government agencies. Now, it may be possible that Soviet Russia will be able eventually to introduce free commodities on a considerable scale. The Roman Empire had little trouble in providing free oil, meat, and other goods for years to the citizens of the Eternal City. It would have been a service to the so-called free enterprise system of the United States to have an intelligent, critical consideration of this proposal. But strong forces in the free enterprise system, which is becoming more and more merely a union of Washington and Wall Street, are set upon propping up the Soviet economy. Indeed, and there are books about this. Check out the Wall Street Trilogy by Anthony Sutton. This was attested to by the visit of a large group of American businessmen to the president on January 7th to urge such action. These gentlemen had little thought that they were merely carrying out Moscow's decision of June 1963 to make the West rescue the decrepit Soviet economic structure. Since this step will mark the second phase of the Bolshevik invasion and attempted conquest of the United States, much will be heard in these pages of this communist decision and of the quick American response once again to this particular new feature of the communist line. Of one thing the student of economic and political history may be certain while granting this possibility for free goods and services, and that is that the second and largest part of the Soviet prophecy will not come to pass, namely the educating of a new man, who will harmoniously combine spiritual wealth, moral purity, and a perfect physique. Such a preview of the perfect man, thus entailing the rejection of original sin, and with it promising the final entry into the earthly paradise, are the very centers of communism's dynamic drive forward. It is an interesting commentary on the unpreparedness with which the American nation has taken up its relations with communism, that on very few occasions has this fundamental idea of Marxism-Leninism been critically considered. So much so is this the case that it can be safely said, from out of a wide personal experience on the subject, that the vast majority of American college graduates cannot correctly answer the question, what is dialectical materialism? And yet it is the belief in dialectical materialism and militant atheism that leads to the determination to produce the perfect man. This is the key to the true nature of communism and why it presents itself historically as the foe of men hoping for freedom, seeking world conquest in order to transform mankind. In the pursuit of these Moscow-Peking ambitions, there have been staged a number of scenes, such as those which saw the Anglo-Saxon pirate farmers sweep across Roman Britain in the 5th century, burning the towns and villas, slaughtering and driving away the Romanized Britons. These barbarians took over the land. So far did they vent their savagery on the conquered natives that they even drove into the forest the pampered cock pheasants imported by the Romans to adorn their terraces, making of this bird that wild pheasant of the chase hunted for centuries. Nor has the 20th century been devoid of those excursions similar to the sweep of the hordes from the depths of Scythia across what is today France, Spain, and North Africa. Likewise, there has been the seizure of cities such as inspired the Christian bishops of the 3rd to 6th centuries to rally the citizens for the defense of Roman civilization. To this widespread clash of arms, there has now been added the use of such weaponry as the barbarian mind could never have fashioned, namely political warfare. By this refined device, the United States and the West, in general, have been induced to engage in what some critics have termed national suicide. In fact, there's a book by Anthony Sutton titled National Suicide, worth reading. The course of the 30 years that elapsed from the recognition of Soviet Russia by the United States in 1933 to the decision by Moscow to get the West to underwrite the Soviet economy in 1963 has been characterized by the success of this Soviet political offensive. Its original aim was to inveigle the United States, in particular to acquiesce in Soviet seizure of what have now become the satellite countries, including Cuba. In the new phase of this assault, the entire West is to be persuaded to become guarantors of present-day socialism and the eventual entry into communism. Any cursory glance at the historical map of the world depicting that world as it was 50 years ago and as it is today would advise us that the major source of the wide growth of communist control has been won in this political or psychological way. Invasion in the 20th century, and according to Bolshevik methodology, is an admixture of a show of force and the shrewd infiltration of the opponent's thinking, so that he, in this case the American Republic, or rather the Anglo-American Empire, accepts as his own policy what Moscow desires. Cuba was conquered for Bolshevism with comparatively little bloodshed, and primarily because the communist line regarding Cuba made its secret way into the pages of the New York Times. This it did through the pen of H.L. Matthews, who has never apologized to the American people for this cruel blunder, but has rather been promoted to an editorship. The same techniques that lost mainland China to the so-called free world also had major weight in befogging the American nation on Cuba. Just as the Chinese communists were represented as agrarian reformers and margarine communists, so Castro was falsely presented as a kindly champion of liberalism. The rise of a communist Cuba hailed in the red directive organs as the Isle of National Liberation becomes as fatal to the United States as the great breakthrough of the Rhine defenses by the Alans on the last day of the year 4006. That breakthrough sealed the fate of the Roman Empire, just as the continuance of Bolshevism in Cuba, in easy air distance of America's national capital, will eternally threaten future hostile inroads in the United States. Accordingly, Gus Hall, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the United States, makes defense of the Republic of Cuba against U.S. aggression a chief duty of the American working class, by which he means that leaders of that class, the Communist Party. In like manner, Fidel Castro himself has threatened the extension of our revolution through Latin America. Speaking of Cuba's socialist destiny on January 26, 1961, Castro exclaimed, "The more successful our revolution, the more backing our revolution gets in Latin America, the more imperialists get angry. All Latin American peoples have remained faithful to our revolution. The Latin American peoples support us in spite of the efforts of the imperialists." No greater victory was scored by Soviet political warfare than persuading official Washington to call off at the 11th hour the air cover at the Bay of Pigs. American officials were the victims of the huge campaign which filled every corner of the nation on behalf of Castro's Cuba. The booklet by the late Professor C. Wright Mills, "Listen, Yankee," reached a circulation of over several 100,000 copies. The product of a Castro follower, its purpose, which it very well carried through, was to muddle the American mind on the communist allegiance of the Cuban Revolution. Accordingly, official Washington and thousands of other Americans were converted to the following falsehoods. But what about the Communist Party of Cuba and its influence here? The first thing you must realize is that this Communist Party of Cuba has never been very large or very strong as a party. Your CIA deputy at the end of 1959 estimated 17,000 Communist Party members in Cuba. Maybe so, it sounds about right. The second thing that's important is that this party did not play any part at all in the making of our revolution. The revolution, as we've told you, we made in Sierra Maestra, and it is there that we really won out over the tyranny. For over 5 years, in fact, before we won the communists, who, when they didn't ignore us, were political rivals of our movement. We owed them nothing when we triumphed over Batista's tyranny. That they didn't help, and any part communists now have in our revolutionary government is because our government gave them that part. The third thing is that the Communist Party of Cuba has been and is made up of some older intellectuals and some very poor people. The fourth important thing, we Cuban revolutionaries of the 26th of July movement are much more advanced than the Communist Party ever was or is today. Every week some Cuban communist or other tells us that they never dreamed we could go so far, so fast, in overthrowing the tyrant, in industrializing, in the land reform, and all the rest of our revolution. The plain fact is our revolution has outdone the communists on every score." End quotes. Professor Mills knew little of the record of Soviet seizures of power, or he wished to deceive the unthinking American on the subject. Almost every communist party in the world has been comparatively small, following the injunction of Stalin that the party is strengthened by purging itself of opportunistic elements. In order to take over Poland, it was even necessary for Moscow to create a communist party. Furthermore, shortly after Professor Mills wrote his strange words, and while his booklet was still widely distributed in America, Blas Roca said something significant. As General Secretary of the Popular Socialist Communist Party of Cuba, Roca informed the comrades of the world in a careful document concerning the communist control of the revolution. Hundreds of episodes somewhat similar to the catastrophe in the Caribbean were recorded during the 30 years since the United States recognized Soviet Russia. By a systematic use of that upside-down language, to which some leading American journals bitterly referred but never fully deciphered, the economic and military power of the United States was much depreciated. In the shifting of metaphors, if the shifting of metaphors may be permitted in such a solemn situation, the American nation is reminiscent of a person totally deaf. Sitting in the midst of its enemies, it bows and smiles at whatever they may say, and thus it is that Moscow, when speaking in quite an open manner, but protected by Aesopian language, give their instructions to the local comrades of the world. Those instructions invariably include the major task of slitting the American nation's throat or getting it to perform that ceremony itself. Seems like we're doing a good job of that now, these days. From open borders to immigration, to all kinds of crazy immigration policies, to endless wars, etc. And now the Great Reset nonsense and shutting down our economy. Anyway, I said I'm not going to do as many comments, so try not to. In the late summer of 1964, the American press and television agencies were intent on expressing their adulation for Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and premier of the Soviet Empire. At that very moment, in August, Moscow issued for the edification of the communists everywhere a special number of the World Marxist Review. Therein was commemorated through its pages the centenary of the founding of the First International, the historical predecessor of the communist machinery for world domination. On the very first pages of that red-covered number, the comrades were told that they were the heirs and continuers of its revolutionary tradition. That is, of the heritage left by Marx and Engels. Such a gift from the past enabled them not only to advance the revolutionary struggle today, but also the better to chart man's path to the future. Whereupon it is prophesied, history examined in the light of science reveals that the ascending trend in social progress and temporary defeats and setbacks notwithstanding a steady advance towards communism. Yeah, like Marx and Engels discovered some kind of real natural law. Ridiculous. It's actually just arrogant. While the United States was in the process of shoring up the economy of the Soviet-controlled nations, this chief directive organ to the comrades was holding aloft the banner of revolution raised first by Marx and Engels and later held aloft by the Bolsheviks in Russia. While American aid and trade, and that of American allies, were building up the strength of the Soviet dictatorships, this word to the comrades was denouncing the USA, specifically as the leading imperialist power. It was further declaring that in the United States of America there was a revival of brinkmanship with more and more open threats of aggression against revolutionary Cuba. Moreover, the U.S. aggressors are fanning the flames of war in South Vietnam, bent on spreading them to other countries of Southeast Asia. The glory of the First International was that it ushered in the grand world historic struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, between socialism and capitalism. And today, the socialist world system was marching to completion, and mankind has entered the epoch of the transition from capitalism to socialism. Okay, crazies. I mean, seriously, it's like Marx thought he was like God or something, and is able to understand all the universal laws that exist. I mean, this is, and that communism is like some kind of has a messianic destiny. It's pretty much an inversion of Christianity to a large degree. Anyway, at the moment that the first explosion of the Chinese Communist bomb was creating something like a panic in a considerable section of the American press, with the cry renewed for recognition of Red China, Hongji, red flag, was dedicating itself to the complete obliteration of the United States. Hongji is the official theoretical organ of the Communist Party of China. In a burning editorial on why Khrushchev fell, this outlook for the world as planned by Red China was given. In quotes, "Ours is an epoch in which world capitalism and imperialism are moving to their doom, and socialism and communism are marching towards victory. The historic mission this epoch has placed on the people is to bring the proletarian world revolution step by step to complete victory and establish a new world without imperialism, without capitalism, and without the exploitation of man by man through their own efforts and in the light of the concrete conditions of their respective countries. This is the inexorable trend of historical development and the common demand of the revolutionary people of the world. This historical trend is an objective law, which operates independently of man's will, and it is irresistible." End quotes. So yeah, this historical trend towards communism is objective law, independent of man's will, almost as if it's Marx God's will. Marxism God's will, or Satan, I guess. I mean, actually, Marx dedicated his book to Lucifer. I mean, he was a satanic man. Just do your own research on that. You'll find it. You'll find a lot on it. Marx was downright evil and confused and very confused and dark. He was in a dark place and wrote some dark things that have had horrible consequences. Okay. While many of the great publications in the United States were demanding that Red China be admitted to the United Nations, this editorial was denouncing the U.S. imperialists, those paper tigers, as Mao Zedong had designated them. It was also repeated, "History will develop in accordance with the laws discovered by Marxism-Leninism. It will march forward along the road of the October Soviet Revolution. That revolution ushered in the dictatorship of the proletariat, which subsequent study will demonstrate is the dictatorship of the Communist Party. Every Marxist-Leninist party today continues to adhere to the absolute necessity for bringing in this dictatorship, even though they cover the force and violence features with the slogan of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. There are different paths to socialism in different countries." And I'm just going to say here, for example, Fabian socialism, which seems to be what they've employed in Europe and the United States. There is considerable irony, therefore, in the free enterprise system, even in its dominant Wall Street camp, preparing and being prepared to bolster up these dictatorships over the captive nations. Something might have been learned by the West from the two features that accompanied Khrushchev's fall. The first of these was the total unpreparedness of American opinion-making agencies for this event. It would have been thought that with billions of dollars expended on the CIA, ambassadorial and consular staffs, and on private newspaper correspondence, the event's possibility would have been considered. One of the major arguments for having an American ambassador in Moscow was that he would prove to be a listening post for information. There is much doubt as to whether or not the U.S. Embassy did not prove to be such a post for the Soviet government, since we now know that it has been thoroughly covered by secret Moscow microphones for at least 15 years. The New York Times nonetheless ran a front-page article expressing official and general American surprise at the Khrushchev fall. Many other papers followed suit. Secondly, as an accompaniment to this political unpreparedness, there was revealed another startling feature. The characteristics of the communist camp at the time of Khrushchev's fall were much the same as they had been 27 years before when Pope Pius XI described them. Published on March 19, 1937, the Feast of St. Joseph, this document by Pius could have proved the most effective of weapons against the onrush of Soviet political warfare. The conquest of Eastern Europe and of mainland China by Bolshevik infiltration, accompanied in 1965 by the loss of free world prestige throughout Africa and what is left of non-communist Asia, has strikingly confirmed the statements of this encyclical. The reason for being of Bolshevistic and atheistic communism above all, as this dominant document declares, is to tear God down from the heavens and crush him into the earth. What's interesting is you see, I mean, the Rockefellers have some demonic-looking beast at the Rockefeller Center. There, you get the I think, whoever the big Rothschilds guy is now, with that literal witch, something Abramovich. She is a quote-unquote spirit cooker. Don't even look into it. It's just sick stuff. Anyway, Lord Rothschild, the one most senior and in control right now, along with Abramovich, stood in front of a painting of the rise of Lucifer on Earth. I mean, it's something like that. Some painting. You can find it. Google it. Or maybe not Google it. DuckDuckGo it. Screw Google. I'm sorry. Just Google is trash. Okay. But yeah, so what I'm saying is, sometimes I wonder if communism itself is not a tool of people with a lot of money like the Rothschilds to just get the populace to be broke and, with the whole Great Reset thing, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. So I want to know who we're going to be renting it from. Who owns the stuff that we rent? Oh yeah, of course, the elites. So there's going to be one, they're going to live in some, not under communism, kind of like Stalin had parties and stuff like that, while people starved in the Ukraine and other areas. I don't know. There seems to, so I've kind of analyzed the whole communist thing, and I think communism is another cover for broader ambitions of the New World Order. That's just me, but you get this like satanic thing going on from just all kinds of people, from quote unquote imperialists like the Rothschilds. I mean, banking and usury and all kinds of not just stuff that's gone on for way too long. To the Rockefellers, to all kinds, just seem to back this atheistic ideal at the very least. Very least, there's that in common with communism. But I think there's a lot more in common. I think they're using communism. And I think communists are themselves being used. The reason for there being Bolshevistic and atheist communism above all, as this document declares, is to tear God down from the heavens and crush him into the earth. It is from the principles of dialectical and historical materialism that the doctrine of modern communism springs. It is from this determination to enforce universal non-belief in God that is derived, quite logically, the tactics and techniques of Moscow-Peking progress over the world. During the entire 30 years in which Washington has agreed measure by measure to Bolshevik advance, the United States has refused to recognize this primary consideration. Meanwhile, the leaders of the communist camp have persistently drilled this foundation thought into the minds of their followers everywhere. In the impressive textbook, Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, Moscow has made the Marxist-Leninist world outlook the very end-all and be-all of communist thought. This outlook is sharply proclaimed to be philosophical materialism. It is said emphatically the indestructible foundation of the whole edifice of Marxism-Leninism is its philosophical, dialectical, and historical materialism. In summation, after many pages of dedication to the anti-God crusade, this textbook sums up: nature is its own cause. That materialist formula signifies that nature is in no need of a creator standing above it, that nature itself possesses the attributes of infinity and eternity which the theologians falsely ascribe to God. By proving the uncreatedness, eternity, and infinity of nature, the Marxist Materialist philosophy provides a firm basis for atheism, end quote. This concept, presenting an entirely different world from that which the believer in God sees about him, pervades all Marxist-Leninist theoretical thought and discussion. It is this which caused Lenin to prepare his elaborate book, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. It is that which, in addition, moved him to sum up the reasoning of that work and in the world outlook of Marxism by declaring in Volume 11 of his selected works, "Religion is the opium of the people." This dictum of Marx's is the cornerstone of the whole Marxist view on religion. Now, today, hearing that's ridiculous. Religion is the opium of the people? How about TV and games and pornography and just the endless slop that is our media? That seems to be the opiate of the masses today. That's the true opiate of the masses. Among other things. But this dictum of Marx is the cornerstone of the whole Marxist view on religion. Marxism has always regarded all modern religions and churches and all religious organizations as instruments of bourgeoisie reaction that serve to defend exploitation and to drug the working class, end quote. Yet, despite the fact that the Catholic Church was actually, the only place where sick people and orphans and it was basically the universal healthcare for the medieval time, mid ages. There's that, and obviously they just want to take that over. But far from being an opiate, it's. I think you'll notice Christians today, of all variant, seem to be a little bit more awake than other religions. For example, I even practiced Buddhism and certain Hindu practices in my long journey, my long spiritual journey, and people I know from those organizations are entirely clueless as to what's going on. Whereas, even if you go to, I was going to church daily at one point, and even at a Novus Ordo church, the people there understood what was going on. Like, the people that went daily, we would talk about the shutdowns, the mandates, the stuff they want to put in you, and have real discussions about it and actually question these things. Now, go to a traditional Latin Mass, and pretty much everyone will be on that page and questioning and wondering what's going on. Protestants used to really understand this. And some do. I have some friends who do. But as a whole, as an institution, the Protestant churches aren't saying much. It seems like they're going along with it more. So is the Catholic Church, for that matter, right now under Pope Francis, and ever since Pope Paul VI, really. But anyway, we'll get into that. Actually, the author gets into that, so let me be quiet and continue. It is also this conviction which marks the 1957 statement known as the Declaration of the 12 Communist and Workers' Parties having control of socialist countries. Issued in Moscow in November of that year, this declaration had figured largely in the debates on the tactics between the Soviet, Russian, and Chinese Communist parties. As its very central thought, we read, "The theory of Marxism-Leninism derives from dialectical materialism. This world outlook reflects the universal law of development of nature, society, and human thinking. It is valid for the past, the present, and the future." End quote. Yes, this all kind of starts with Hegel. That's how we get to Marx, kind of. Just going to say that right there, the philosopher Hegel. I'm forgetting his first name right now. I just always referred to him as Hegel. Phenomenology of spirit and all that. He kind of sets the scene for this dialectical materialism. I don't think he'd be quite happy of where it went, but certainly not with Marx. But yeah, there's that, and then you also have to consider Plato's Republic as an inspiration to these elites that we have, whether they're in communist countries or not, of the New World Order, the unelected elites in the EU. You can go back to Plato's Republic and they like it. They love it. It gives validation for what's going on today. Now, I like Plato. Socrates, you know what I mean? I love a lot of his stuff. Plato himself actually worked on the idea of his republic after his quote-unquote philosophical career, I guess after Socrates died or something, and actually got to play out the republic, and it was a complete failure. Trying to play out the ideas of the republic in reality, kind of like communism, just ended up in bloodshed and death and starvation and central control. But I understand Plato and his thought. I understand the Republic. I understand where they're coming from. I don't like it, but in my youth, when I was in high school, I was seduced by the Republic. I loved it. I thought we needed philosophers to be kings because people, the ignorant masses, were just kind of stupid. That is how I thought. I still think most people need to read, to say the least, need to learn a little bit, or we're in trouble. And that's been how I felt for a long time. And at one point, I thought the Republic was kind of a solution to that. I thought, dictatorship, whether of some kind, needed to be done because people in democracy can't be trusted. And I still don't like democracy. I prefer a republic with laws, and we call ourselves a democracy now instead of a republic. We're a republic. America is a republic. It means we have a constitution and laws, not just, that we elect people and elect ideas, and through them elect our ideas and our will. No. No, I think democracy is terrible, and it always devolves into anarchism, which then devolves into tyranny, or into tyranny essentially, or chaos and starting again. Build back better. Nor should reasonable men have overlooked, as America leadership did completely, the report on this subject made in Moscow in June 1963. For the moment, it is determining the fate of the United States and its great society, entitled Present Tasks of the Ideological Work of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This report, made for the then Premier Nikita Khrushchev by Leonid Ilyakov, recommended that fatal step against the West, which would have been considered audacious a few years before. The measure suggested and adopted was nothing less than the persuading of the mammoth Wall Street industrial financial interests to underwrite the Soviet economy, which did happen. This meant once and for all that these interests would induce the American nation to find betrayal, to the final betrayal of the captive peoples. Sorry, let me say that again. This meant once and for all that these interests would induce the American nation to the final betrayal of the captive peoples, about whom beautiful resolutions have been adopted every July, but for whom the American Republic had done absolutely nothing. They would also be unwitting means of defeating the United States in the national liberation wars. Like the People's Liberation Army, because they'll come and liberate us and, just wave a red flag and you'll be okay. No, they're going to look into everything you've done, and you say one wrong thing, you're done. Just look into the purge with Mao and how many communists were purged and quote unquote useful idiots. Yeah. They would also be the unwitting means of defeating the United States in the national liberation wars that Soviet ambition was unloosing in Vietnam, the Congo, and Latin America. It was Wall Street, Moscow, anticipated by this tactic, which would paralyze the hand of Washington when it came to replying to these alleged liberation wars, and thereby would assure Soviet victory. Interesting, because we do indeed have a union of Wall Street and Washington right now. a very unhealthy one, in which, if you, and this is Alexander Mercouris from the Durand. I recommend following them on the Durand.locals, not on on YouTube too. Get off YouTube, just pay $5 for their excellent reporting, and you will find that in 2019, the Federal Reserve bailed out the banks to the order of trillions of dollars and gagged the press about it all. What's going on? And then we hear about inflation now, and it's like we're not talking about what happened in 2019 with Wall Street, and that was right before COVID, pretty much. So, I mean, interesting. Just gonna put out there, it's gonna Wall Street and U.S. have some, and communism has some weird thing in common, and it's bizarre because you would think Wall Street would be scared of communism. Such an appeal to American secularism and greed was logically accompanied by the inauguration of a new war upon religion throughout the world. Necessarily, this would be conducted more subtly in those non-communist countries where a belief in God still has a considerable number of adherents. Accordingly, we must read in Ilyakov's report, religion must be opposed by militant, vigorous, scientific, atheistic propaganda. Reminds me of college. And the accompanying resolution of the plenary meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union obediently registered the order for a new struggle against religion, deciding that the scientific atheistic activity should be developed more widely. As we approach the denouement of this recital, viewing the promised Götterdämmerung that will accompany the Bolshevik final conflict for the Earth's possessions, we shall have occasion to plumb the depths of this denial of God. For the moment, it can be known that Lenin's fervent curse in his letter to A.M. Gorky runs in varying forms through all communist plans and purposes. We repeat it from page 675 of volume 11 of Lenin's selected works. In quotes, every religious idea, every idea of God, even every flirtation with the idea of God is unutterable vileness, unquote. Now, I have a friend who is a communist. He's an old friend, and I'm not just going to not be his friend because of this, okay? We got to try to communicate with people and change their minds. I'm going to talk to him about this, actually, because he practices Hinduism. And I just want to slap him in the face and say, dude, Lenin's selected works say, quote unquote, every religious idea, every idea of God, every flirtation with the idea of God is unutterable vileness. And that includes his Kali. My friends worships Kali. Anyway, again, it's the ignorance. People don't get that communism is just going to destroy everything they also like on the side. There are alleged apologists and spokesmen for the West who seek to soften such forthright but harsh communist beliefs. There has been a strained attempt during 1964 to present the late Palmiro Togliatti's memorandum from Yalta as a plea to the communists for a letting down on their atheism and the bringing about a coexistence with religions. Such is but another evidence of the eagerness with which not a few of the American Republic's mouthpieces gloss over Soviet aims for the benefit of the Soviet camp. Togliatti's memorandum was considered of such value by Moscow, which had only shortly before decided upon a new atheistic campaign, that it was distributed to all the active comrades of the world in Bulletin 22, issued without cost by the World Marxist Review. To win Catholics to the communist cause, it recommended the crude show of atheism to be dropped in favor of a more subtle approach. Catholics were to be gently shown the content of the religious mentality, which always entails presenting its class content, and also how this mentality attains its roots in the masses. Okay, and now we have Pope Francis, who is a socialist. And I don't consider him my pope. I'd rather be Orthodox and I like the Orthodox people. I mean, I don't have any problem with them. It'd be nice if we reunite and have a real pope. Anyway, so yeah, now we have not only have a socialist pope, but I'm sure this author will bring up at some point, unless it happened after, I can't remember, the testimonies of Leela Dodd. She was also someone who worked with the communists, and she said during the somewhere in the early 1900s, the communists infiltrated the Catholic Church and ordained communists in the number of like tens of thousands into the priesthood, into the seminaries, into the systems. And we wonder why our church is why the Catholic Church is a mess today. This is nothing against Catholics here. This is against what's been going on in general. I more than anyone would just love to see the Catholic Church back to its power it had, let's say, before the 20th century. Because they did good things like preventing Hollywood from spewing filth. And many other things. I have no antagonism towards the Catholic Church. And I am to a good degree Catholic, but as I said, I've also sampled other religions, and I just am so curious about things. It's my flaw, I guess. I don't consider it a flaw, but I'm sure my Catholic friends consider it a flaw. But that's about me, and let's not talk about that. So, yeah, it's just amazing how, yes, they really did attack the Catholic Church and were successful, sadly. Thus, the problem of overcoming this religious mentality was to be achieved. Clearly, Comrade Togliatti is interested in lying down with this lamb of religious belief only in order to destroy it. To reinforce this understanding among the comrades, while American and Western minds are thoroughly bewildered, Luigi Longo supports that interpretation of the Togliatti Memorandum in the leading directive article in November 1964 World Marxist Review. Longo stands high in Moscow circles, having succeeded Togliatti as General Secretary of the Italian Communist Party, the largest in membership in the non-communist world. Permission must also be claimed to unveil one other striking feature of the Togliatti Memorandum. It is nothing other than the carrying forward of the current communist line of getting Wall Street to back the Soviet economy by winning Western aid seriatim for individual socialist countries. So rapidly has this scheme matured that even the New York Times has become alarmed. That paper it is which has cheered on the grants to Red Poland, although that regime has opposed the United States constantly, and even though it has bugged the American embassy in Warsaw. On January 9, 1965, only 6 months after the issuance of the memorandum, the Times published a startling editorial. It denounced the projected sale of 20 million synthetic fiber plant to East Germany by 2 American companies. This act, that paper contended, not only strengthened the Stalinization of that area, but also offended Bonn. It must be understood at once that this overall adherence to atheism charged by Pius XI and acknowledged by Moscow and Peking produces that peculiar morality which has often led to the mystification of the United States. In order that this would be appreciated fully again by the comrades everywhere, Moscow issued in 1964 an attractive booklet on communist morality. Published just before the fall of Khrushchev, it contained expressions on the subject from all historic communist leaders. These ran from sayings by the now fallen premier himself, back through many others to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Each and all reflected vividly the famous declaration by Lenin to the Third All-Russian Congress of the Russian Young Communist League, made in 1920, We say that our morality is entirely subordinated to the interests of the class struggle of the proletariat. Our morality is derived from the interests of the class struggle of the proletariat. Yeah, he says it 2 times, not just me. Okay. That forthright explanation leaves no doubt that every major communist act is considered moral if it advances communism, and immoral if it retards such an advance. Although the late Professor R.N. Carew Hunt declares this form of morality to be simply the old maxim erroneously fathered upon the Jesuits, that the end justifies the means, America has never awakened to this reality. Almost like a confiding child, it has been led by Moscow to accept every new reiteration of peaceful coexistence as something new and glittering. This has gone on from the time of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin to now. At the very moment when President Lyndon B. Johnson was being inaugurated, the Associated Press had dispatched from Warsaw a message on the opening of the Soviet bloc summit talks. With a strange complacency, this story said that these talks could bring fresh moves for an understanding with the West. What should more properly have been told American readers was that these talks could bring expanded political warfare in the invasion of the West under the guise of peace. Indeed. The West's guard in these respects can be well strengthened when we note that all the other attributes ascribed to atheistic communism by Pius XI bloomed even more virulently at the time of Khrushchev's fall. By then, the Soviet regime, now proved erroneous by experience, as witnessed in the shortage of wheat in all the agricultural countries behind the Iron Curtain. Moreover, his question, how is it that such a system can spread so rapidly in all parts of the world, was doubly answered in the way he had explained it. There was, first of all, the challenging reality that still too few have been able to grasp the nature of communism. Yes, indeed, even especially communists here, and I'm sure like many of those people in Antifa who probably haven't picked up a book ever. Anyway, there was even more triumphantly the victory of that diabolical propaganda which even reaches the better-minded groups of the community. It is this, the communist line, which has so modified and molded America's thinking. Then there is, stronger than ever, the conspiracy of silence in much of the press and other communications media. Indeed. As a summing up characterization, there is the trickery of Moscow and Peking, which has so often acted as an ignis fatuus for the Western peoples and their governments, drawing them into the bog of appeasement and complacency to their deadly discomfiture. Each of these papal pronouncements will claim our consideration as we survey the onward march of Bolshevism intrusion into American thinking and functioning. That check on tyranny and misery promised by the Great Society is itself imperiled by this intrusion. On the day after the presidential inauguration, one of America's great newspapers not given to belligerency against Bolshevism exclaimed, "Americans can hardly build a great society if the rest of the world is ravaged by hunger and turmoil," to which another eminent journal editorial added, "Where the chief threat lies to the fulfillment of the American dream is in the trickily shifting and treacherous tides of foreign affairs." When reference is made to foreign affairs, it must be borne in mind that such matters do not deal only with what happens in some country abroad, but with the decisions made in the national capital of the United States. As a student of communism once wrote some 13 years ago, Stalin's greatest victories, which have brought 700 million people under his heels since 1945, were gained not on the battlefield, but here in our own country. Hesitation has been the chief mark of American policy in these foreign affairs, interrupted only by such acts of firmness as the stand at Quemoy and Matsu, which was crowned with smashing success. Today, the refusal to permit General Douglas MacArthur to achieve victory in Korea is haunting the United States in the rice paddies of South Vietnam. Yes, General Douglas MacArthur is another one to look at as far as what happened to our military since World War II. It wasn't just that we became less effective, it was that we started working with the United Nations and had this whole idea of containment rather than winning wars, which doesn't really make any sense. But, yeah, what of our foreign policy does make sense now, anyway. And that was then, so anyway. Now that frequent past American acquiescence in Soviet conquest has encouraged Moscow to woo Wall Street, the gauntlet of political warfare has been thrown down to the West as never before. Peering into the historical mists of the days to come, this generation discovers major queries to which it must respond. The first of these is sharply and succinctly put: does God actually exist? Has he created man, or has man created him? As of today, the American nation as a nation appears to have no idea of what its reply should be. Okay, and this was in 1965. Now today it's much worse. It has been converted into a semi-atheistic land, an official champion of agnosticism, by the United States Supreme Court decision on prayers in the schools. The Soviet certitude of unbelief is met in America by what seems to be the tolerance of indifference. In its original decision against prayer, the Supreme Court did not rule upon any petition to a specific form of the deity. The prescribed utterance driven from the schoolrooms was not addressed to Allah, Jehovah, Jupiter, Zeus, or the first person of the Blessed Trinity. It was an act of dependence and devotion to Almighty God. It was this act and utterance which were decreed to be opposed to separation of church and state as set forth in the Constitution of the United States. To make the record complete, it must be recorded that this same Chief Justice who stimulated this no-prayer decision publicly participated in reverence to God in giving the presidential inauguration oath. It is such spiritual and philosophical ambivalence which marks the leader of the West and goes over into the political warfare arena. In no case has this uncertainty proved more fatal than in the American response to Moscow's battle cry, repeatedly raised, peaceful coexistence. From V.I. Lenin to Leonid Brezhnev, this cry has led the United States into dark ways. As the West stands on the threshold of a new phase in the world political upheaval, it is a major moment as to whether this peaceful coexistence will finally come to be recognized in the true Soviet sense as the extension of class war for world conquest. And that is the end of Chapter 1, or page 26.